So good afternoon, everyone, and good morning, Patrick, and welcome to this open lesson organized by the Water Harvesting Lab of the Department of Agriculture, Food, Environment and Forestry of the University of Florence, Italy. So the Water Harvesting Lab of our department is a laboratory which is active on interdisciplinary research in the field of water harvesting and was established in 2017. So our research topics deal mainly with water harvesting, which is the process of concentrating precipitation through runoff and storing it for beneficial use. We have different research lines, such as participatory approach to water harvesting, system design and management, effects of water harvesting on ecosystem services and microclimate, fog collection, flood-based farming systems, water conflicts, hydrology of wadi, which are very dry ephemeral rivers, water-related ecosystem services, and nature-based solution in general. So this is a snapshot of our resident staff. You see that Professor Bresci is the scientific coordinator, then we have Professor Fabio Salvitano, who is associate, and then me, Giulio Castelli, I'm a postdoc, and our colleague Laura Vicini, who recently joined our lab. We are developing at the moment 4 different projects. 2 of them are based in Italy. The first one is about nature-based solution. The second one is about agricultural water management. And then we have a project in Angola, basically filling and giving water to transhumant shepherds in a framework of climate change. But then we have another project that will start soon in Niger. And here again, we will provide local communities with water harvesting systems. This is a little bit of our research and scientific outreach. And you see here why we are pushing a lot on microclimate, because our latest research interest is about the interaction between water as a climatic factor and other climatic parameters. And it's very important to underline that water harvesting is a way to keep water in the soil, to keep water in the landscape, and this directly affects microclimate. This was the topic of the international online course of this year. And again, we are also realizing studies at the global scale, which are linked again with the lesson of today, that is rather at the global scale. Which will be published soon. So, I mean, if you follow our channels, this will be a relevant publication that will be delivered, we think, in a few weeks. Just finally, I want to point out that this webinar is not a real webinar, but is an open lesson. So, as you may know, as Water Harvesting Lab, each year we organize an international online course on water harvesting. The course of this year was, in fact, on water harvesting for microclimate management, and was organized with different partners. So in this course, we advance our knowledge about how water harvesting can affect local climate. And I just want to point out that the webinar of Dr. Keys was planned initially within the course. Then, given the relevance of the topic, we decided to make an open lesson also for external people not enrolled in the course. Just in case you might be interested, we are running this course since 5 years. And next year, we will have, next year actually, at the end of 2020, we will have another course about water harvesting for soil and water conservation, and the application are expected to open in a few months. So in case you are interested, just please contact us. These are our contacts. So you see, you can, stay in contact with us with a large number of channels. We also have a website, and again, we are based in Florence, but what we have a large number of international collaborations. So just in case, drop us an email. We will be very, very happy to answer and to discuss with you possible cooperation. So coming to the webinar of today, I will present now the speaker. So Dr. Patrick Keyes, I will present him actually through his website. I think you can see it. I will later send it on the chat of the webinar. So Dr. Keyes is the leader of the Human Environment Interaction Research Group at Colorado State University, especially in the School of Global and Environmental Sustainability. Is a very well-known researcher on sustainability and in general on green water, and moreover on moisture recycling. So the phenomena of evapotranspiration and recycling of moisture by land and forest in general. And in latest year, he developed a wide series of very interesting papers on the concept of green water management, aerial rivers, and also moisture recycling. So we really think he can be the right person to deliver a really relevant webinar, an open lesson for the course of today. So now I am just leaving the floor to him, and I wish you a very good and productive lesson. Just let me mention that the webinar of today is recorded, and if you have some questions, we will have a question time in the end. So basically, we will have around 30 minutes of presentation by Dr. Keyes, and then we will have 30 minutes of question and answer. If you have a question, just please drop it in the chat once the webinar is finished, and we will gradually answer to everyone within the time limit. Thank you again, and now I'll definitely leave the floor to Patrick. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's see here. Let me try and present my screen again. And if this is anything like the lectures that I give normally in the courses that I teach, when I click share screen, the entire thing will fall apart. So we'll see how it goes. Let's see here. All right. Okay, can you see my screen now? Thumbs up, yeah, okay. Okay, great. Well, thanks for that fantastic introduction, and I'm actually really thrilled to give this talk that I'm about to give in this context, because a lot of the time I'm speaking about atmospheric water recycling to sort of communities that are actively doing that. So terrestrial moisture recycling, atmospheric water recycling, modeling studies, etc. And so it's exciting to give this talk to a different audience that's very interested in green water and water management, but maybe is approaching the topic from a slightly different perspective. And so just to provide a little bit of background, I got my my PhD from the Stockholm Resilience Center, and my master's degree from the University of Washington in hydrology. And so my PhD was in sustainability science, but my master's is in hydrology, and then my bachelor's was in biology. So I've got a whole mishmash of a background. And so the way I approach a lot of these questions is from a very interdisciplinary lens. And I'm not going to dive too much into that right now, but if we want to talk about that at the end of the talk, that's just fine. And I also want to preface this talk by saying it's going to be very conceptual and introducing a lot of new concepts, hopefully new concepts to you. And so it may seem like I'm not diving into a lot of technical detail, but the point here is that I wanted to almost, like if you're thinking about a computer, we want to create the new file folders that you can put this new content into. And then later, if one of these topics is really interesting to you, hopefully you now have the vocabulary and the familiarity with the concepts to start digging a little bit more deeply. And I should also say that if you're interested to have a conversation after this at all, please contact me via email. I love talking about this stuff. And so I just want to preface it that way, that's sort of what the tone of the course or the open lesson will be like today. So with that, just a quick outline. We're going to cover what the atmospheric water cycle is and what I mean by that. We'll discuss very briefly what moisture tracking and the concept of the precipitation shed. Then we're going to talk about two things that are very relevant right now in terms of how we manipulate green water and the atmospheric water cycle. So first, in terms of distant evaporation and what that can mean for the atmospheric water cycle. And then talking very briefly about the direct manipulation of sort of atmospheric water vapor at altitude, so in the atmospheric column. And then we'll come back to the sort of how does this relate back and sort of ask some, hopefully some provocations, some questions around how this relates to microclimate management, maybe even mesoclimate management, and sort of what that might mean moving forward. So let's dive in. So first off, which water are we talking about? So this is probably a figure that, or something like this is something that many of you have seen before. It's a depiction, a simple kind of cartoon of what the global atmospheric water, or global water budget is, I should say, not atmospheric, but global total water budget. And I have a hunch that a lot of what you've been talking about so far in this course has been more focused on sort of the surface water in terms of thinking about local surface water relationships, runoff, infiltration, how to capture maybe some more of the kind of local, maybe fog capture, that sort of thing. But we're gonna leave that area for a little while and go up into the sky, because this is sort of where I think about the water cycle, and more specifically the terrestrial water cycle. So really the fluxes of evaporation, transpiration, interception that enter the atmosphere from the land surface, where it flows over the land surface through the atmosphere, and then where it falls out as precipitation, rain, snow, hail, all of those. And the reason that I'm so interested in this is, oh yeah, and I was going to show you a video, but I realized that this video is not going to work at all on a webinar context. So I included this YouTube link, and then I'll make sure that I make it available after the lesson today. But this is a global simulation of atmospheric water vapor from the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and it's just a beautiful simulation. More than anything, it's just a beautiful video to watch, where you get to see the flow of atmospheric moisture around the planet. And so it's almost just, it's fun to watch from an aesthetic perspective, but it also contains and conveys how you can even see it now in the static image, the structure of atmospheric water. It's not a totally chaotic system. It's not as though the water is just flowing every which way. Water in the atmosphere flows in specific patterns, especially on an annual basis, and we can exploit information from those patterns, but we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So why would we be interested in this terrestrial atmospheric water cycle? What is it? Why would we care about that part of thinking about maybe surface evaporation and how that relates to the atmospheric water cycle? Well, one way to think about this is when we think about the fraction of water that people use in a given grid cell, around the world, green water is a very important component of human water use, especially for rain-fed activities. So this is a zoom in of the African continent, but you can look in the lower panel to the right, and you can see that globally, the green areas, the dark green areas, correspond to places where most of the water that is being used in that location is coming from green water. And so if you're not familiar with green, blue, those two words, essentially the way I think about it is green water is the water that's in the soil column, that doesn't form surface runoff, that doesn't flow into lakes and rivers. It's the sort of the water that you don't see. Whereas blue water is really the water that you see. It's the water that forms surface runoff, that maybe percolates down to the groundwater table, that pools and ponds and lakes and rivers, and then of course all the oceans. But on the surface of the earth, the land surface, people by and large rely on green water for rain-fed production, for agricultural production, for timber harvesting, all of those things. And so if we are so reliant on this pool of water, green water, then we ought to understand how it connects via the atmospheric water cycle to itself and other places. And this is, again, probably a simple diagram that maybe you've come across in some form. I think it was Johan Rockström and Malin Falkenmark, which first sort of published a figure like this that really summarizes the distinction between green and blue water, and then tried to summarize in a global scale the flows of water and the partitioning of that. And so we see this kind of the blue water forming the surface runoff and the deep percolation, and then the green water is really this actively exchanged part of the water cycle. It's the part that evaporates directly to the atmosphere and then precipitates back down. And a lot of these figures, there's this fantastic paper I should point you to, which is by Sophie Wierich I can't remember where she's at, but it's from a paper called The Need for Green and Atmospheric Water Governance. And in this paper, she really does a great job of consolidating all of the knowledge up until pretty much now in terms of what's out there for green water management and atmospheric water governance, where are the needs, et cetera. And so you'll see a couple figures from that paper because it just does a really nice job synthesizing a lot of this content. So another way to think about this, don't worry, but this is a super messy figure. We're going to zoom in on this upper right-hand corner. So I just mentioned this idea of green water is this actively exchanged evaporation precipitation domain. So we could categorize different landscapes based on that. So there are some landscapes that are going to be really dominated by maybe precipitation and then surface runoff. Evaporation is negligible. There might be other systems. So like in the lower right-hand corner, you could think of the Dead Sea between Israel and Jordan. And that's an endorheic basin. And you have runoff going into that basin, but the only way that it can really exit is via evaporation. And so you have these different hydrological systems that you can classify. And the one that I'm mostly interested in is this almost this pure green system. So in the upper right-hand corner, you can think of this as a grassland in the United States in Wyoming. But you could think of almost any system. I mean, Sub-Saharan Africa is really heavily characterized by pure green systems where they're dominated by precipitation and evaporation and almost negligible surface runoff. The savannas, the prairies, many of the grasslands that are active rangelands fit this category. And this is a huge area of where humans use the landscape in terms of rain-fed agriculture, rangeland production, et cetera. So it's a really useful place to start looking to better understand things. And I just want to also say, so a lot of this atmospheric water recycling work I'm about to show was done with these colleagues. Lena Gordon at the Stockholm Resilience Center, Lan Wong Erlandsson there, and then Ruud van Drent at the University of Delft, or TU Delft in the Netherlands. So this is a very technical figure, and so try and follow it with me. We have evaporation rising from the ocean, flowing through the atmosphere, and precipitation falling out. Hopefully you're all with me. This is super technical. I'm just kidding, it's not super technical. But this part of the water cycle, just evaporation, water transport, and precipitation, this is something that you can see. This is just a handful of references. This is something that we've understood for a long time very well about the atmospheric water budget, the balance. Now, this part where water re-evaporates from the land, flows through the atmosphere and falls back on land is something that is still being actively studied. This is something that we're getting a better handle on, and we have a sense of the broad continental patterns of what this looks like. But this is an area of active research where we're trying to better understand what these processes are, how they function, what the mechanisms are, especially when we start thinking about land use changes, anthropogenic land use changes. And so a global picture of what this looks like, if you can follow that cartoon, let's go back here. If you follow this cartoon, so this terrestrial land surface part of the atmospheric water cycle, we can zoom in down here and you can see the little cartoon. Right now we're looking at evaporation that rises from the land surface and will flow through the atmosphere and fall out as rain somewhere else. Okay, let's zoom in on East Africa. Let's look at kind of the Great Lakes, Kenya region. That's a darker green in this figure. What that means is a larger fraction of the evaporation arising there will fall out as rain somewhere else on land. I should say precipitation, but in Africa, it's almost certainly going to be rain. So the other side of this is we see this is evaporation. The other side is the precipitation. So if we follow that little cartoon in the lower left-hand corner, now we're looking at the precipitation from terrestrial sources, the precipitation from upwind land surfaces. And let's look at kind of Eastern Eurasia. So you see Siberia, Mongolia, parts of China, Tibet. That's receiving upwards of 60% of its rainfall from terrestrial sources. Okay, so this is something, and these sorts of figures have been made by lots of different people. I just provided one paper. This was one of the papers that I wrote a few years ago on this topic, but lots of people have made these figures. This is not something that only I have done by any stretch. Hopefully at this point, you're sort of going, all right, yeah, well, how do you do that? How can you possibly get like a global picture of this sort of part of the atmospheric water budget? And, oh, wait a second, these are out of order, sorry. Let's back up. I'll tell you how we do that in a second. But what I want to show here is the reason that we're interested in this is that it's not just kind of, let's better understand the atmospheric water cycle. This is a part of the water cycle we're changing in dramatic ways. So when we think about land use changes, especially dramatic land use changes like deforestation in a tropical rainforest or irrigating a desert where there was almost no evaporation, now there's a significant amount of evaporation, we're really changing potentially changing the atmospheric water cycle. And so here, this was a meta-study or a meta-analysis done by Dominic Spracklin and some co-authors around modeling studies in the Amazon basin, where they looked at something like 90 or 100 different studies of deforestation in the Amazon that simulated the full water cycle to try and understand if you cut down the whole Amazon or different parts of the Amazon, how does that affect the precipitation in the Amazon? And they found this pretty clear relationship where if you were to cut down most of the Amazon, you'll decrease rainfall by about almost 20% in the Amazon, which actually surprised me. I thought it would be quite a bit more than that. But it turns out that it's still going to rain in the Amazon, even if it was bare soil, just because it's in the tropics, et cetera, et cetera. But there was very clear agreement and a very clear signal that decreasing downward trend. And then kind of to take a step back from just deforestation, I put together, this is a little bit old now, and this is just a handful of papers where they looked at the integrated atmospheric water cycle. So a change in land use, a change in evaporation, and then a corresponding change in precipitation to get the full picture of how land use change could affect this whole kind of moisture recycling, atmospheric water cycling. Long story short, more vegetation typically leads to more rain, and less vegetation typically leads to less rain. This is a huge generalization, I recognize, but in general, this is the kind of emerging pattern that we see from these integrated modeling studies. And I should say that integrated modeling studies is one of the only ways we can really disentangle some of this phenomena. Because we can't do large-scale experiments like, let's just cut down the Amazon and see what happens to the atmospheric water cycle. I don't think very many people would go for that. And so we can look at natural experiments. So a good natural experiment, and somebody that's really done great work there is somebody named Oba Tweinenberg, looking at parts of the Ganges River and looking at irrigation in that area and understanding how has massive increases in irrigation changed the atmospheric water cycle. Okay, that's sort of a natural experiment. So we can look at those sorts of phenomena. But in general, this is sort of a motivating factor, more vegetation leading to more rain, less vegetation leading to less rain. And we're doing that all the time, right? We're changing the land surface all the time. So we better understand how we're impacting the atmospheric water cycle if we're going to be sort of walking around blindly doing this. And so this is another cartoon. This is just another figure from Sophie Rurick's paper, where we're looking at the kind of global terrestrial moisture recycling and how with intact vegetation, it leads to something like 61% at a global scale is recycled, whereas there's a reduction of some magnitude. I wouldn't be too attached to these numbers in specific terms, but just know that this is a robust finding in terms of reducing vegetation on the land surface reduces this terrestrial moisture recycling, this atmospheric water cycling on the land surface. Okay, I'm probably going to talk too long. I'm sorry. I'll try and speed things up. So all of that is sort of background for saying, okay, there's this whole aspect of the atmospheric water cycle that we're only really starting to understand. But unlike surface water, we don't have kind of a convenient unit for this analysis. How can we talk about this in a way that's experimentable, replicable, and thinking about it in a very management-oriented context? For surface water, that's easy. We've got the watershed. We have river basins. We have these coherent units. In groundwater, we have a capture zone. We have all these coherent units that are kind of well-studied, and at least in a watershed context, it's topographically defined, right? Water flows downhill for the most part, and it goes to some outlet and forms a channel, stream flow, a river, and so forth. That's not quite the same thing for the atmosphere, but we're still going to try. And so this is an idea that was proposed probably about 8 years ago, called the precipitation shed. And it's known as the watershed of the sky, and it contains all of the upwind surface area that sends evaporated water to fall as precipitation in a specific downwind location. What does that look like? So in a conceptual sense, this is what that is, where we have this large area called the precipitation shed, which captures all of this water. It flows into the atmosphere, these little squiggly lines, travels through the atmosphere and falls out as rain in some sink region, some specific location. So this is a conceptual diagram. In practice, this is what it would actually look like. And so this is a figure that was made a few years ago for the country of Uruguay in South America. So that little yellow area is Uruguay. And we can see that the blue colors correspond to evaporation. And actually it corresponds to a millimeter per year quantification. So let's say the dark blue colors here are 16 or more millimeters per year of evaporation will fall as rain, or precipitation, I should say, in Uruguay. And so this is a way to get a sense of, okay, so in an average annual basis, so this is something like a 35-year average, to get a sense of like, what is the shape of this thing and where is this water coming from? And I'm not going to show figures about this today, but we've done some analysis of the variability of this phenomena, like how much is it changing? Like, is it constantly shifting every year? Or is it maybe, or is it maybe a little bit more coherent or coming from the same place? Because if it's shifting every year, then it doesn't really make sense to talk about this because it's chaotic. We can't predict it. There's not really any structure to the system. But it turns out that they're much more stable than that. And so, for example, for this precipitation shed for Uruguay, we get a sense that this shape, these source areas are pretty robust year to year. Now, some years this source area may contribute a little bit less or a little bit more, but it's more that oscillation, that pulsing, than it is actually a shifting. And that's an important finding, and it means that these boundaries might actually provide some sort of meaningful management information. Okay, this is where we see, how in the world would we calculate something like this? So imagine this is a pretty, farmland with a cloud and a rainbow, very nice. And so imagine that you're that little droplet of rain, or evaporation, I should say. We flow into the atmosphere and then we fall out, okay? Boom, atmospheric water cycle. If you take nothing else from the lecture, you've got it, okay? But we have a model. And so we divide the atmosphere into two sections, a lower and an upper, to get at the wind shear. And we keep track of where this little droplet goes in the lower section, where it goes in the upper section, and then where it flows out and in which direction. And so we do this for every location on the planet at a very fine time step. So you saw 1979 to 2014. Right now I'm running simulations from 1979 to 2019. And we do it at a sub-daily time step. So we get a very fine resolution sense of where this atmospheric moisture is flowing around the planet. Or we can get a fine resolution sense. You might be saying, where in the world do you get data like that? And so we use this quasi-climate model observation data called climate reanalysis. If you're not familiar with what a climate reanalysis is, there are lots of different agencies around the world which produce these sort of, they have a climate model which they sort of freeze, and then they pump in a bunch of different observations. So everything from satellites to surface measurements to ocean shipborne measurements to weather balloons to aircraft, you name it. And that helps to constrain the estimates that climate reanalysis is representing. And we use that to sort of represent realistically what the climate has been like for the last 40 or so years, sort of the satellite era. Okay, so there are lots of different examples of applying this work. So in practice, applying this idea of the precipitation shed and kind of getting into the management aspects of atmospheric water. We don't have time to go into all of that. And actually, I think today the most interesting one might be talking a little bit about governance of these relationships. So hopefully I've convinced you, A, that this matters, B, that there is this phenomena of land surface water recycling in the atmosphere, and then C, that that we can actually talk about sources and sinks in a discrete way, that these systems have some structural predictability and that give them a potential management or potential kind of governance opportunity. So again, at the very basic level, we're talking about sources of atmospheric moisture and sinks of atmospheric moisture. And these arrows correspond to where the recycling is happening. You might have some local recycling in a source and some local recycling in a sink, where your evaporation might come back locally as precipitation. That would be in this kind of microclimate domain. But you might also have this distant transport. And so if we think about governance of moisture recycling, atmospheric water cycling, from this kind of geophysical or geopolitical perspective, it helps us to get a sense of, I think, what this might mean in kind of an actual practical context. We have an emergent sense of surface water in an international law, transboundary water law, that sort of thing. We have nothing like that for atmospheric water. And so here, this is a study that I did where I chopped up different parts of the world to try and identify the moisture recycling relationships that take place. So we have a North American domain, a South American domain, a domain in the Sahel, broadly defined, and then a huge domain in Eurasia. And so Russia, and then a huge chunk of the Asian continent. And what we did is we wanted to look at the exchange of moisture among nations. And so this is maybe an odd way to show that. This is called a chord diagram. It has, actually, there's lots of different, dependency wheel, lots of different names. But what this allows us to see is the relationships, the interrelationships among different countries. And so here, this is the simplest one. This is North America. And we can see right off the bat that these huge lines coming from this ocean section is actually sending water. So most of the rain that is falling in the United States, Canada, and Mexico is coming from the ocean. This is not a big surprise, but it is helpful to understand that those kind of precipitation regimes, the source of that moisture is maybe less manipulatable. We can't interact with that as much or change it as much because it's really governed by changes in the global oceans. But there are some kind of interesting phenomena taking place nonetheless. For example, let's look at Canada. Okay, this is the red section. And we can see that while Canada receives over half of its rainfall from the ocean, it does recycle a lot of that rainfall internally. So upwards of maybe 15% of Canada's precipitation is recycled internally. Another 10% or so is actually coming from the United States across the border. Okay, well, that's interesting. And then another, 5% or so is coming from other land. And so this is kind of these marginal categories from other terrestrial surfaces. In this case, that's mostly China and Russia. And so we can do that for lots of different parts of the planet. But suffice it to say here, most of the water that's falling as rain in these countries is coming from the ocean. And what is exchanged among a very small set of countries. As you can maybe expect, it's going to get a little bit more complicated as we go to these other sections of the world. So here, marching clockwise, we have Brazil, Uruguay, Paraguay, Bolivia, and Argentina. And what I want you to do is I want you to start at Brazil, okay? And look at the far right side of Brazil. And hopefully you see these tiny little sections in Brazil. As a fraction of Brazilian evaporation, this is very small. But you can follow them, those little tiny lines. You can follow the connection between Brazil and Uruguay, Brazil and Paraguay, Brazil and Bolivia, and even Brazil and Argentina. And you can see actually that Brazil provides around 25% of Uruguay's precipitation. Brazil provides around 25 to 30% of Paraguay's precipitation. Brazil provides 25% of Bolivia's, and maybe 10 to 15 of Argentina's. The take home here is that, not surprisingly, Brazil is a huge country and it has a gigantic tropical rainforest. Okay, no surprise there. And so it's probably not that surprising that it is important in a continental sense for supplying moisture. What we should appreciate, though, is that from a management or governance perspective, all of a sudden we have maybe a more specific, quantified sense of this connection. So maybe is there a responsibility owed by Brazil to these other countries for managing its forests in a way that can sustain normal precipitation in these other places, whatever that means? This is an open question. This is an area of almost no research has been done in this sort of cross-boundary atmospheric sense. Okay, let's just keep going. We're going to look at, I'm not going to go into the details as much here. This is the Sahel. So if we march from east to west across the Sahel, again, broadly defined, Somaliland, Somalia, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Sudan, South Sudan, all the way over to Senegal. If you squint, you can see these little tendrils, these little connections that actually follow this geographic east-west gradient. And that's the trajectory of some of these prevailing wind patterns. And so you can see these threads that connect and interconnect these different parts of the Sahel with one another. And then finally, looking at that big Eurasian section, we can see China, India, Pakistan, Nepal, Bangladesh, Mongolia, etc., going around. And we see that this is actually sort of a mess, okay? And this is owing to the fact that there's all sorts of competing wind patterns. We've got multiple monsoons, prevailing mid-latitude jets. We even have some tropical interactions in the south. So the exchange of moisture in this continental region is actually very complex. So to make sense of this, to zoom out, what we did is we tried to come up with some archetypes, simple ways of conceptualizing the exchange of moisture. And the reason we did this is because this is something that can be used more effectively for talking about it from a transboundary law perspective, from a transboundary policy perspective, if we can distill these atmospheric relationships to something that's a bit more tangible. And so here we have a type 1 system, which is an exchange among a small number of countries. Type 2, one nation provides a lot of moisture to another country. Type 3, moisture is cascading through. And then type 4, where this is a kind of a complex network of exchange. Okay, so we can hold those in our mind. And now we're going to step through to talking about the actual, like, what does this mean in management terms, all right? And I'm going to talk about this from two perspectives: the manipulation of green water, that means evaporation, including transpiration, interception, et cetera, all of what we've talked about so far, as well as direct manipulation of atmospheric water, vapor, dew, fog. I've spent a lot of time on this first one and much less time on this second. And so I'll talk in more detail about this first one and then sort of provide some ideas about the second one. So again, we just saw this North America, this figure. This is just showing what I just kind of talked about for the last little bit in a different way. And there are different governance approaches, and I'm going to step through each of these. But this is how they sort of track. North America is this sort of simple system, all the way down to kind of East Asia and the Sahel being a more complex system. And we sort of have four different approaches that we could think about for management. We have trade and certification approaches, sort of financing approaches, assessment or ecosystem assessment approaches, and then sort of planning style, scientific organization style approaches. And that will make more sense in a minute. So for example, if we're talking about the management of moisture recycling relationships with kind of land use change or potential land use change in one area and changes in moisture recycling somewhere else, we could think about things in terms of, these would be non-international legal sorts of enforcement. These would be more kind of alternative forms of management, such as sort of trade and certification. Like you go to the local grocery store, you buy some product that has a certification that this would be certified. Now maybe we could fold moisture recycling management or stewardship into, say, something like the Forest Stewardship Council. This sort of opportunity to sort of piggyback alongside existing management and enforcement regulatory schemes, so that we don't have to create entirely new things, but relate them back to, say, land use management. Okay, well, how could moisture recycling be folded into some of these trade and certification schemes? And this would be appropriate for different types of systems, more or less, very appropriate for type 1, maybe 2, and possibly 3, depending. All of this stuff, I have the references here, and I'll make sure the slides are available later on, since I'm going to be zooming through a lot of this. Other things are thinking about funding. So if you think about the beneficiary of moisture recycling, so let's say you're an investor in Norway, and you invest in a soy plantation or some ranch lands in Brazil, okay? So you're going to be financially involved in this land use change, which has implications for the rainfall in Uruguay and beyond. So how can we fold financing or funding of these schemes, international sponsorship, so forth, into stewardship of these kind of green water and moisture recycling resources? So international sponsorships, international finance could facilitate evaporation protection in a way. And again, I should say, we're already doing this, right? Like, so all of these sovereign wealth funds, large scale investment, land grabs, if you will, are already investing in changing the land and by extension, changing evaporation. So we're already doing that. But so this would be flipping that backwards and saying, what if we were to say, do it in a responsible way, in a way that sort of took into consideration the ecosystem side of things here, rather than just trying to maximize profit. Okay, another way to think about this was ecosystem service assessments. And this is actually something that different international NGOs, so Conservation International and the Natural Capital Project, are collaborating right now to try and come up with a globally relevant estimate of ecosystem services provided by different landscapes around the world. And they want to try and fold moisture recycling into that. And so what does that actually mean? Where's the entry point for thinking about sort of green water management in the context of moisture recycling? In the context of like protecting the land surface, protecting trees, protecting existing land uses, perhaps. Again, all of these are really just kind of provocative, suggestive, because there hasn't been very much research in this area yet. And then finally, we can think about sort of scientific agreements, policy level agreements. And this is where it would be really interesting to have conversations with the sort of the surface water crowd, thinking about integrated water resources management. That's become a phrase, an idea, very well established now in surface water governance and management. And it actually, it's a topic that has relevance at international scales, right? Like we talk about integrated water resources management for international river basins. What would that look like if we started talking about that in the context of precipitation sheds, for example? If we started talking about integrated water resources management in the context of atmospheric water? Obviously, that could make things totally blow up and fall apart. But I think this is another avenue through which this idea of how we're manipulating the atmospheric water cycle might not have to create new management and government structures, and could rather fold into and get folded into existing structures. Okay, so that was a very fast overview of sort of how we're talking about governance and management at the large scale. Again, we're zooming out to the large scale in this talk of green water. Now I'm just going to briefly touch on the manipulation of atmospheric water. And I'm really happy that you mentioned fog capture and fog harvesting right at the beginning of the introduction to this talk, because that's an area that I don't know very well. And I was going to touch on it, and I decided not to, because all of you are going to know a lot more about it. But I would actually really like to, maybe after the talk more about that, to learn from you as well. But I'm just going to briefly touch on some aspects of atmospheric water capture. And this is a really cool paper that I found a little while ago called Progress and Expectation of Atmospheric Water Harvesting. And this is a classification of all of the different ways that sort of atmospheric water can be captured, including fog water, dew water, and then kind of concentrating water directly out of the atmosphere using different membrane technology, as well as cloud seeding and others. And this is, again, is sort of a nice summary table about the different methods for capturing atmospheric water, and then features, capacity, like what's the potential yield, problems, etc. I'm going to talk about cloud seeding because that's relevant at the scales that I'm talking about right now. If you want to check out, this is what that paper looks like. It's been very useful for me to kind of organize this topic. But let's briefly talk about cloud seeding. And I should say, up until probably a year ago, I thought cloud seeding was just sort of like, yeah, that's not really a thing. Like, that's not effective. It's not really perceived as a very effective technology. But it turns out there's been a lot of recent research published around this very coordinated set of experiments that were led by the National Center for Atmospheric Research, where they had various mobile radar units different specific experimental designs that have more or less quantified saying, yes, cloud seeding can work. And I'm going to walk you through that. And if you're not familiar with cloud seeding in general, there's these two little cartoons here. One, you have ground-based dispersal of these little particles that water vapor can precipitate onto and then fall out. So essentially, you're providing nuclei for precipitation to form, artificial nuclei. And you can distribute that from the surface of the Earth or from airborne release. And so just to zoom in, or just to talk briefly about this project, this is the SNOWY project that was, again, led by the National Center for Atmospheric Research. And they had this coordinated project of having these mobile radar units that were perched in very specific locations, and then airplanes that would fly specific unnatural patterns in, say, a zigzag pattern that would allow them to say, if precipitation is forming from this zigzag pattern, we know that that's not a natural way for precipitation to form, and we can attribute that to the actual cloud seeding operation. And also, just to sort of briefly show, when we're thinking about what this actually would look like in practice, these are 4 different types of sort of cloud systems. So if you want to look in the lower right-hand corner of each panel, and you can see, so the first one says atmospheric river. You can see northwest flow, shallow orographic, and then convective. These are just different kinds of cloud formation and water vapor transport in the atmosphere, and how cloud seeding might interact in a different way with those different patterns. This is actually a sort of a picture of the results of a cloud seeding operation. And actually, it's pretty cool. You can see in this left panel, the panel A, this is the actual deposition of liquid equivalent snowfall in millimeters. And you can see the striping, which corresponds to the pattern of the airplane travel that seeded that cloud. So sort of long story short here is that even though cloud seeding and weather modification has been deployed for decades around the world, all over the world, only recently has sort of the scientific kind of community said relatively definitively, yes, this can work. Now, it has to be in the specific conditions, but the jury is no longer making a decision. The jury is in, and the decision is that actually cloud seeding can work. And to me, this was sort of a huge revelation, because I thought, okay, yeah, you know, people are spending a lot of money on cloud seeding. We don't know how effective it is. Maybe it's doing something, maybe it's not. But now it's no longer a question of whether or not it can work. It's whether or not it will work in the specific context. And to me, that's an entirely different question. And now it really opens up sort of a Pandora's box of potential issues, particularly around governance and management of this potential technology. Again, it's not going to work everywhere, but the fact that it does work and has been sort of, I guess you could say, blessed by the scientific community, to me, that gives me pause, because it makes me think, well, now we have to be thoughtful about what this actually means in an atmospheric water cycle context. So just to kind of continue just briefly talking about what sort of cloud seeding governance there is. In the United States, for example, states, so individual states like Colorado and Wyoming and New York, et cetera, they can regulate weather modification. They have that existing capacity to regulate cloud seeding activities. And then federally, it's expected that you would report what you're doing to the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, okay? So that's within a country, and just within the United States, for example. But what about among countries? And that's where I would start to get a little worried. And there's something called the ENMOD, or Environmental Modification Convention, and this entered into effect in 1978. And it specifically targets environmental modification that can induce damage or destruction. So in other words, sort of like weather warfare, which again sounds like science fiction, right? Like this is, I'm not trying to be crazy here, but the fact that cloud seeding actually sort of has been demonstrated to work means we need to start asking some of these forward-thinking questions about how does this fit into existing environmental management when it comes to the atmospheric water cycle. This is just a map of the parties to this convention, the countries that have signed the convention, and the countries that are non-signatory nations. So essentially, these are the countries that the green ones are abiding by it, the yellow ones have signed, and then the red ones are saying, no, we haven't signed yet. And this is an important thing to sort of look at. So which places around the world have agreed to avoid doing this sort of weather modification? Which countries have not yet agreed to do that? And I didn't have time to do this, but it would be interesting to overlay this sort of map with, say, places where foreign direct investment, also called land acquisitions, also called land grabs, are taking place. Because I bet we could probably see a correspondence between the places where land acquisitions are actually occurring and actually this map. I would say the same thing with probably a map of water scarcity in a lot of ways. Okay, so just to wrap this up, sorry it's gone a bit long. So just thinking briefly, and this is a few provocations around this topic, the future of microclimate management, maybe even the future of sort of mesoclimate management. I won't say macro. So what would it look like to have potentially long-term, maybe seasonal forecasts that include land use change influence to evaporation? What would happen if now you, on your kind of seasonal forecast to know how much precipitation you can expect in the next few months, it also included a forecast of what wildfire likelihood would be like to burn down some forests upwind from you, which might change the delivery of moisture. This isn't something that exists yet, but it could. One thing I think that I didn't talk much about today, but that continues to have a lot of promise and like kind of positive outcomes is small scale local fog capture. As a form of atmospheric water capture, this seems to be one of the most grassroots, the most positive, like normatively good thing potential for local communities, because the technology can be owned, built, and directed locally. Now, this is different maybe from kind of the very high tech, like nano mesh that's being developed for different fog capture methods. But in a local sense, this is something that is kind of repairable and workable on a small scale. Something to zoom out to a big scale, and maybe something that is not at the capacity of a local community, but at the capacity of a state or a country or a private company, would be tailored forecasts about cloud seeding potential. So you could think about, if all the conditions have to be right, you have to have super cooled atmosphere conditions, the right concentration of cloud movement, good forecasts of where the clouds are coming from, et cetera. If you have the capacity to capitalize on that sort of information, then you could pay for these tailored forecasts and then potentially get a lot of water out of that sky. Again, this is no longer a scientific question. This is a question of technological innovation, and that would then drive down costs to produce or deploy these sorts of technologies at scale. It's expensive. Cloud seeding is still very expensive, complicated, and it's still in its infancy. The project that demonstrated the effectiveness of cloud seeding was very expensive. It required all these mobile radar units, all sorts of things. So right now, this is not a problem. But in the future, depending on the kind of advancement of technology, where does this leave us? What do we need to be thinking about now to avoid some situations in the future? And finally, who has access to this information? So for the tailored forecasts, for the long-term forecasts of land use change, who has access? Is it government, federal? Is it federal agencies, or is it private companies that are sort of selling this information to whoever can pay the cost? And I think something that in the hydrology community, maybe probably in the microclimate community, you talk about this a lot more, but in the communities that I sort of actively interact with, we don't typically talk about power and who has power in a situation and who doesn't. And so in thinking about these sorts of information, who has access to information about the atmospheric water cycle in a practical operational sense, and who doesn't have access, and how does that maybe reproduce inequality? That's a conversation for maybe a different time. But I think that those are questions that we still ought to ask. Okay, so then that's the outline again. I just want to say thank you, Grazia, for your time today, and I'm happy to take questions. I know I went over time, I'm sorry about that. But thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you to you, Patrick. I think it was really an amazing presentation, amazing webinar. And do not worry for being overtime. I think everyone enjoy a lot. I propose we could have around 30 minutes question and answer. I mean, if we have now enough question. To my experience, this kind of webinar, they usually have a lot of questions, so I will allocate 30 minutes and then we close because we have a time limitation. You can see, if you open the chat, that we have already, I think, 2 or 3 questions. I don't know if the question of Agustin Brenna is the same question, maybe rephrased. And you see that I also put the links to 2 papers on our side on fog collection, because I mean we work also on this. I think you mentioned this purposely. We also explain a little bit of fog collection in our course. And yeah, I mean, I can leave the floor to you for answering the questions, starting from the one that were posted, and I ask the audience to ask more questions via the chat. Please use the chat and keep your microphone muted.
Okay, so this is the question that says, what is the pattern of green water recycling observed in the Ganges, since the basin has 30% coverage by the glaciers and forest, and then 70% agriculture? And how does it vary in a drought year? I can confidently say I don't know off the top of my head, but I would say that I can direct you to papers that have looked at this in detail. And again, I'll just type this in right now so I get the kind of real time here. Oba Tweinenberg has done a lot of work on kind of the Ganges Brahmaputra, and has looked into a lot of those dynamics, particularly around irrigated lands in that part of the world.
Okay, thank you.
I'm sorry I can't provide a more satisfying answer.
Okay. Thank you, Patrick, because I am interested in that, because I am working in these river basins. I will look into it. Send me the links. Okay.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and maybe I'll try and get those links into the chat window before we close it down.
Okay.
Okay, sorry. Let's see. Next one. Have you tried to link the annual behavior of precipitation sheds to drought occurrence? A little bit. So, the follow-up question is, can we infer that meteorological drought is mainly caused by precipitation sheds? I would say no for the second question. So essentially a precipitation shed is just it's like a unit. It's like a way to define a region that we're going to actually look at and consider and quantify. So it would be a watershed allows us, because sort of gravity and topography tells us what the watershed is, right? We don't need to kind of invent or come up with some probabilistic method. Hold on a second. Okay, so we don't need to come up with some probabilistic method about how to define a watershed. Whereas with the precipitation shed, you define it based on either an amount of evaporation contribution or some the 70% of the moisture, you capture it that way. There are different methods there. Now, I think one thing that is interesting is to look at how they change with drought occurrence. And so one way to think about that is in a paper, let's see here. I don't think I have any of the slides for that paper. It was looking at kind of megacity water security. And what we did is we looked at the dry versus wet year precipitation shed dynamics for these different megacities and their corresponding precipitation sheds. And so what we were able to find is that there are some distinct patterns. And one thing that does continue to come out, and not just in my work, but in other people's work, is that during drought years, terrestrial recycling, so the recycling on land, becomes more important, relatively speaking. So in other words, the ocean decreases its contribution of moisture, which means the land now becomes more important during those dry years, dry spells, as well as drought years. And so it's, from a science perspective, it's very interesting because it means that during the times where water is most needed or most critical, that it's also most dependent on this terrestrial moisture recycling process, the land surface itself. So the stewardship of the land is most important during the most critical times, these drought periods. So hopefully that answers your question. And again, I can drop in some resources to provide a little bit more analysis for that. Any other questions? You better ask some questions. I'm going to start singing and dancing.
I think we have a couple from Michael Brambilla.
Oh, I didn't. Oh, look at that.
Yeah.
I didn't scroll down. Oh,
There is another
you're
one
lucky.
from Sophie Tewirik.
Hey, okay. So sorry I didn't scroll down. Everybody's doing a good job of asking questions. I'm just doing a bad job of scrolling down. Okay, so from I'm not going to say names because I'm going to totally butcher them. Are there any specific areas, regions worldwide where reforestation or conservation are more effective than others for the green water cycle? Are there any studies about this topic? This sort of touches on an interesting thing, and there is a lot of work around sort of where are the best places, like the hot spots where we could plant forests or we could conserve land, more broadly speaking, preserve land that would be advantageous or beneficial for the atmospheric water cycle. And so this is a whole kind of area of study about, what are the processes at play here? And this is sort of why I said earlier that this is an active area of research. We don't totally understand what planting a forest in this place will actually do. We can model it, we can simulate it, but we don't actually know in practical terms. There are some natural experiments happening right now. We think about the Great Green Wall of the Sahel. That's a pretty significant natural experiment. The same goes for the forests that are being planted in Western China and Northwestern China as a barrier to kind of desert encroachment. So what are the consequences of that? And we don't totally know yet. I think that it would be likely that it will interrupt or change the atmospheric water cycle. I think it would be, I would expect that to happen, but that's not necessarily the most beneficial or kind of the best kind of restoration opportunity. There's also, so there's lots of ideas around how to quantify where to do that. In my mind, the best place to look is the places where trees have been growing on their own for thousands of years, if not hundreds of thousands of years. And that would be in the tropics. Trees seem to grow there pretty well, so it would be best to not cut them down in the first place because they're providing all sorts of ecosystem services, and they're very productive, and they provide all sorts of other benefits, biodiversity, et cetera. And it's really hard to plant them again. Once you take away the forest, especially in those kind of poor soil environments, it's hard to bring back the forest after that. And so the best places to conserve, I would say, are the places that have the densest tropical forest, also because of all these other ancillary benefits. I'm not sure if that totally answers your question. Let's see. Okay. So I'm reading firstly, I wonder what is your stance on the precipitation shed governance approaches that are most likely to be successful in a transboundary context? When taking Brazil, for example, it seems that there are a few mechanisms that help preserve tropical rainforests at the moment. Would you be in favor of strong financial mechanisms to support preservation of important source areas? Possibly. So Brazil is complicated, not least because of the existing administration. The Bolsonaro administration in Brazil has really changed from previous administrations in terms of how it's protecting or not protecting Amazonian rainforests. And so up until very recently, Brazil had a relatively strict policy around how kind of deforestation, cattle ranching expansion could unfold in the Amazon. Also, and a lot of this, so the big stories are really in the interior of the Amazon at the borders of Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil. And so Bolivia also had really strong protections. And if you actually, all you have to do is go to Google Earth and you could zoom in and look at almost the deforestation patterns really follow some of the state and national boundary lines. And that speaks to not just effective policy, but deforestation leakage. So effective policy, say in Brazil, for example, could lead to the leakage of deforestation. That is, people deforesting just go across the border to a place that has lower enforcement, less enforcement, or even kind of better laws for them if they want to cut down forests and start a cattle ranch. And so in thinking about sort of the transboundary management of land surfaces for this sort of green water management, it is necessary to take an international perspective in a lot of ways because of how these sort of leakages of opportunities can take place. Now, in terms of financing, I think there's a lot of really interesting research that's coming out, particularly from the Stockholm Resilience Center, actually, around these global financial actors that are driving significant ecological change, particularly in the Amazon. And it's a very small number that account for a very large fraction of the deforestation or the kind of change in land use. And so I would say that's a really convenient starting point to look at, okay, well, if it turns out there's only 10 companies that are really involved in this, driving this deforestation, and most of them are big finance companies that are sort of trading commodities, that's a good starting point. What if we were to get them around the table, the same table, to have a conversation about what they could do in a coordinated way to change the way they're financing some of this stuff, to incentivize better stewardship rather than just saying there's no rules, so we're just going to play like there's no rules. I think that could be an interesting starting point, and that's actually happening. So in the ocean context, a completely different topic, but for fisheries depletion and fisheries collapse, there's an effort to focus on the key big companies that are really driving that fisheries collapse as a lever of change. And I think the same could be said for looking at sort of terrestrial land use change, deforestation, that sort of thing. Okay, so let's see. Okay, I'm not sure I follow the question. Can this type quantify them and that will help in solving the water sharing conflicts between countries?
No.
Maybe you can, yeah.
I just want to know that because transboundary waters are there, like cloudburst and rainfall happens and then the river starts from one place to another. Forest is there at both the places because the conflict is there in sharing. If you quantify the green reprecipitation, that will help in understanding between the two conflict nations.
I see what you mean, yeah. Okay, so I would say in theory, yes. I think one of the challenges is that green water, especially when we think about the atmospheric water side of things, is much more probabilistic than, or it's less deterministic than surface water. Surface water, if you're talking about, let's say, the Nile Basin, for example, if you have good monitoring on what the Blue Nile is doing and what the White Nile is doing, and there are not a whole lot of invisible dams out there, you can have a very good sense of what your stream flow will be like in a reasonable amount of time. Surface water lends itself very well to modeling. It's really hard, don't get me wrong, but it's more deterministic in many ways than, say, atmospheric water. And so because of that, trying to attribute a certain amount of green water from this place and a certain amount of green water from this place for a policy context is actually pretty hard because it is very stochastic. Now, I think that's a good thing because then it lends itself better to sort of cooperative agreements saying we don't know exactly how much. We know that it's important and we know that our collective stewardship is important. But on any given day, I might be more important or you might be more important. And so in that sense, it could lend itself pretty well to kind of regional cooperative agreements that would say we are collectively going to talk about how we're managing our land, because I can't say with confidence that what you're going to do is going to matter tomorrow, or maybe it's going to be what I do tomorrow. But we know that in the whole, what we do collectively is going to matter. And so maybe that's a little too kumbaya, too kind of like holding hands, peace sign. But I think that I honestly think that there's potential evidence that that happens in some contexts with surface water, even in transboundary contexts. But I think that aspect of green water, the atmospheric water cycle, it could even more push it towards sort of cooperative agreements. You could have a free-for-all, right? To say, well, we can't quantify it, so we're just going to do whatever we want anyway. Or you could say, well, we can quantify it well enough regionally to say that we ought to talk about what we're doing collectively.
Yeah, collective. That is right. Any paper, something like that, available in this conflict?
Let me think. So in terms of talking about for green water and atmospheric water, again, there's not a ton out there. So Sophie is on here now. She's added some comments and she wrote that paper that I mentioned at the very beginning of the talk about kind of very up-to-date current synthesis of green and atmospheric water governance. And so I would start there, honestly. That's going to be the most up-to-date compendium of information on this topic. But again, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I wrote a paper in 2017 called Approaching Moisture Recycling Governance. And really it was just trying to say, here are some ideas. Hopefully people can now run with them a bit more. Now, an area that has a lot of scholarship around it is cloud seeding and weather modification. There's been a lot of international legal scholarship, policy scholarship around cloud seeding and weather modification on large scales. I mean, the whole Environmental Modification Convention, ENMOD, that I mentioned, that was signed back in 1978. And so there are some aspects of this field that are very well developed from both a scholarly and legal and policy field that are almost like ready for that conversation. The green water modification, green water management is, I would say, less developed. If somebody else knows differently, please, please, please chime in. But that's just my sense. Let's see here. Okay, so another question. Thank you for your, you're welcome. There are many evidence that show that forestation may reduce blue water at the catchment scale, and deforestation may increase blue water as an effect. Yeah. How do you think this affects the local scale? Yeah, okay. Thank you for, so the question about the forests leading to increases in blue water, sort of like increasing runoff, that sort of thing. And there's a really great piece of work that sort of divides up on a landscape basis, or sort of like an ecosystem type basis, by Ian Calder. I'll just write the name for now. And I think it's Ian Calder. And it was a great classification to say, in these particular contexts, you might see this sort of observed phenomena of an increase in kind of blue water runoff. But then that's not always true, and it depends both on the type of vegetation, the type of climate, etc. And so if I can find that, I'll drop that in the chat window here or provide some resources after the fact. But I would say, yes, in some cases, cutting down the trees can lead to an increase in runoff. And the question is it just because you've cut down the trees? Is it because now there's just nothing to absorb it? That complex relationship about how land use change, deforestation can lead to more runoff and less, I think that's what you're saying, yeah. Wait, you're saying it will reduce blue water, the catchment scale. Okay, this is the opposite of what I thought you said. Oh, okay. Yeah, so cutting down forests may increase blue water, right? Okay, I got it. And reforestation might reduce blue water, okay. I'm gonna stop trying to say it out loud because I'm gonna get it confused again. Yes, I think that's true in some contexts, but I would point to Ian Calder's work. Let me see if I can quickly pull it up. Anyway, I'll try and find that resource for you, because I think that's contributing to the conversation around that classification of landscapes does a lot of good intellectual work for figuring out, okay, well, yes, that's true, but not in every context. And I think that's probably pretty important to understand. Okay, I think, have I answered most of the questions?
Yeah, I think we have time maybe for another question, and
okay,
that's all. So if we can get just one final question, or let's wait a minute, maybe they need to write down, otherwise we can close. Okay. I think we can close the session. It's with really great pleasure that I thank you again, Patrick. I hope, I mean, we can I mean, maybe have and meet again, maybe with this COVID. I remember when we met in Stockholm 2017, so Yeah, and yeah, it was. I really appreciate your work. I read almost everything, so that's a great pleasure to host you. And I just want maybe if Professor Bresci can address the final remarks of the webinar, and then I will close the record.
Okay, thanks a lot. I really want to thank you very much because it has been a very interesting webinar, and the number of persons that attended the webinar is more than what we expected. So it has been really very useful also for other people that were not in the water harvesting course. And from my side, I think there will be also a good point for a future collaboration. So let's try to see if we have the possibility of working together on some point of connection that's for sure I have seen during your webinar. So really, thanks a lot again.
Yeah, it was a fantastic opportunity to sort of speak to a new audience, so I really appreciate it as well.
Okay. Thanks a lot.
So thank you everyone again. I'm going now to close the record, and then we will say goodbye definitely. Thank you.